So welcome today to our guest speaker, Melissa Gustin, whose talk is going to be A Nauseating Lissomness, Evelyn de Morgan, Rome and the Snake. Melissa L. Gustin currently holds a collection online early career research fellowship at the Watts Gallery Artist Village, working on mythological subjects in the permanent collection. Following her PhD on American woman sculptors in Rome in the 19th century from York University, which was awarded in 2018, she held the Henry Moore Postdoctoral Research Fellowship from 2018 to 2020. Her scholarship focused on neoclassical sculpture and classical receptions in the long 19th century, with wider interests including archaeology and art and literature, 3D scanning and printing, contemporary artists working in response to antique and modern art, mermaids and mushrooms. So quite the mixed bag. She's been published in the Burlington Magazine, 19th Century Magazine, Art History, and it's forthcoming in the Journal of Latin Cosmopolitanism and European Literatures, and several edited volumes on art, gender and literature. So our esteemed guest today, who's well qualified to give this talk, and we're very much looking forward to it. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I will give a warning that about 2/3 of the way through, there is a video of a snake shedding its skin. I will try and remember to give you a warning before that happens. It's really gross, but it serves a purpose. And thank you to Sarah for having me. So I'll just get started. In 1875, on a dress allowance kept purposely scanty, quote, Evelyn Pickering, quote, a handsome girl, not yet 20, went to Italy for the first time. Having recently refused to be presented at court, threatening apocryphally to kick the Queen, and chafing at the limits of the Slade School, Pickering took herself to Italy to learn from the old masters and the new artists working in the Anglophone artistic communities in Florence and Rome. While there, she modelled and had cast in bronze a fine head of Medusa, now untraced and known only through one photograph and a plaster cast in the National Trust collection at Lanhydrock House. This talk will think about Pickering's access to antique, Renaissance, and modern art historical precedents in Italy and in England, and their formal, intertextual, and symbolic impact on her early work. In particular, I want to think through Pickering, whom I'm going to particularly call De Morgan's bust of Medusa and its relationship to some other Medusa images, particularly by young women artists in Rome, and how Medusa and the snake relate to ideas of rebirth, rejuvenation, and artistic inheritances in the city of Rome. The iconographic element of the snake is particularly key here, and will be seen to represent not only the characters in Ovid as sort of an iconographical, we know this is Medusa thing, but an allegorical figure for the cycle of artistic rebirth and rejuvenation offered by Italy. This is not, I repeat, not an attempt to read Evelyn de Morgan's life into her sculpture as a biographic predetermination, which I've written about elsewhere in relation to Harriet Hosmer. That's the Journal of Latin and Cosmopolitanism and European Languages, which just came out last week, but an attempt to think about how these works of art might speak to more elusive and ephemeral ideas. I am going to refer to her as De Morgan throughout, as that's the name she's better known under these days, but it is worth noting that at the period in question, she was Evelyn Pickering and wouldn't marry ceramicist William De Morgan until 1887, which I'm sure this audience is very familiar with. And as I'm sure most listeners here are aware, she was born to upper middle class parents, was the niece of pre-Raphaelite adjacent John Rodham Spencer Stanhope, and was provided a classical education alongside her brother, by which I mean she learned Greek, Latin, French, Italian, and German, classical literature and mythology, history, and science. I am contractually obligated to drop G.F. Watts in wherever I can, so I'll note that Watts called Evelyn and her first younger brother Spencer, quote, the most beautiful children he had ever seen, and having expressed a wish to paint Spencer, he completed a portrait begun by cousins, which shows a little face of rare loveliness and refinement. Evelyn's was a privileged upbringing, which allowed her to take drawing lessons from age 15, in addition to having close familial and social relationships with Stanhope Spencer and Watts, an exceptional position from which to begin as an artist. In 1872, she was enrolled at South Kensington National Art Training School, now the Royal College of Art, and then moved to the Slade School, where she won a prestigious Slade Scholarship and a number of prizes. Her sister, Anna Maria Wilhelmina Sterling, wrote later in her biography of William and Evelyn, inventively titled William de Morgan and His Wife, that her parents had attempted to stifle her professional aspirations early on. The chapter, titled The Thorny Way, opens, from the days when Evelyn stole water out of the gutters in order to paint, this occupation became more and more of an obsession, and still more was it looked at askance by her elders. While still quite a child, so great became her absorption in what was looked upon as a passing mania, that it was feared her health would suffer. And at length, as in nursery days, the mandate went forth that she was not to paint, while her drawing master was secretly given instructions to tell her that she had no artistic talent and would be well advised to turn her energies in another direction. In acting thus, her parents were influenced by dual motives. First, the belief that her devotion to art was not serious. Secondly, the fear that it might become so. In the face of such familial disapproval, young Evelyn painted in secret and was working in oils by 12. When she was discovered, she was finally allowed formal lessons and almost immediately scandalized her art tutor by drawing a male nude when she was only allowed fruits and flowers. A workaholic, she recorded in her diary her working habits and her frustration with enforced idleness and chit-chat when she could be working. At 17, she was finally allowed to attend the Slade School of Art, which had recently begun allowing women pupils, including contractual Watts reference, Mary Seton Fraser Tytler, the future Mary Seton Watts, at the same time as Evelyn. De Morgan was, to her embarrassment and frustration, to be accompanied on her walks to and from class by a respectable matron for propriety's sake. She rapidly and regularly evaded her chaperone, with Sterling reporting, quote, "Forthwith, it was a usual sight to see Evelyn, her long hair flying in the wind, racing excitedly to her work, while far away, on the other side of the road, the stout mate Burgess toiled breathlessly in a vain endeavour to keep her in view." She was furthermore averse to following the prescribed track for young ladies. When her mother arranged for a relative to present her at court, De Morgan wrote back, quote, "I'll go to the drawing room if you like, but if I go, I'll kick the Queen." Sterling is at pains to note that, quote, "This represented no personal animosity on her part to Queen Victoria. It was merely a protest against folly in the abstract." She also wrote that young De Morgan suggested the only way she would be brought out in society would be to, quote, "drag her out with a halter around her neck to sell her." Evelyn was recognized as a star pupil, winning prizes for drawings from the Antique and Life and the Slade Scholarship, but apparently felt the school had little left to teach her. In 1875, at the age of 20, and having sold a few pictures, De Morgan decided to decamp to Italy, where Anglo-American artistic communities had existed since the 1830s. These were particularly centered around Rome and Florence, especially by the time Evelyn rocked up with, quote, "a dress budget kept purposely scanty." In Italy, quote, "She studied or paced the ancient city lost in dreams of an impersonal past and a personal future. She dwelt, absorbed on the glories of the Renaissance. She drank in the poetry, the pageantry, the daunting antiquity of her surroundings. The beauty of Italy satisfied her hunger. The love of it was to leave her only with life itself." So, no pressure on Italy or anything, or any pressure on her to succeed following this trip, given the threat from her family reported by Sterling that to pursue a career as an artist would see her wholly cut off. Apart from Rome, De Morgan also spent time in Florence and visited Perugia and Assisi with friends. The sites of Rome and Italy offered De Morgan examples of antique and early modern art which would inform the rest of her painting career, and Sterling noted that the works from this period, quote, showed, quote, "the classical severity of her earlier manner first blended with the mellow beauty of Italian art." Although the clearest impacts on De Morgan's work come from the big names of Italian early and high Renaissance painting, your Botticelli, your Raphael, your Michelangelo, we can also see their impact in her early rare sculpture. It's during this period that De Morgan modeled her head of Medusa, illustrated in Sterling and seen here. Although Sterling is light on detail about the process of making such an object, it is likely that she followed standard sculptural practice, building up a clay model over an iron frame, then taking a mold to take a plaster cast, from which a bronze could be cast or carved in marble. This, Sterling notes, was cast in bronze in Rome, but it wasn't exhibited until 1882 at the Grosvenor Gallery. It's now untraced, having been in Sterling's collection until the 1950s, and sold and displayed in London in the 1980s out of a private collection, but not seen publicly since. This means that the bronze is only recorded in photographic form and a few textual descriptions. It's 31 inches tall, according to the studio, and according to Sterling, and depicts a woman with her chin slightly tucked and her gaze apparently looking outwards. The bust is square cut, but seems to give the impression of a robust body. One snake slips down the sternum, leaving its slithery sibling sliding over her rough hair like a serpentine snood. The profile, and the only photograph of the bronze eye or Sarah Hardy, as far as I know, has been able to trace, is this one in profile. And it's reminiscent of those in her paintings, and something like the love potion seen in detail here. Sterling describes it as, quote, "It is as largely handled as it is strong and noble in conception." There we go. Its gaze is full of a pronounced studio. The massive head is majestic in its pose. Its gaze is full of a brooding melancholy. The snaky locks entwined above its brow are full of a nauseating lissomness, while to add to the realism, one reptile has detached and lies apparently writhing at the base of the neck. The whole conveys a sense of evil, of strength, of relentless force, yet mingled with a tragedy so profound that it provokes a terror which is akin to pity. So there's a couple things here. Sterling's biography of her sister is not without problems. It performs a very late Victorian, sort of not like other girls, strong female character origin story that certainly wouldn't look out of place in any young adult novel starring a girl who really just wants to go her own way in life and definitely doesn't want to arrange flowers or embroider. You can just see 18-year-old Evelyn running through a crowded street like Saoirse Ronan in Little Women, right? GIF here for illustration. Some of the more colorful anecdotes might even have been inventions of Sterling, like the bit about threatening to kick the Queen. The text is highly moralizing and is certainly as a family biography, and one that spends a lot of time telling the reader how hot and smart all of her ancestors were, is biased towards painting the relevant figures in the best possible light. Furthermore, De Morgan, even at this age, wasn't a blank slate working alone in a void, nor was she without precedent in producing this kind of work. Indeed, at least two other young women artists had produced busts of Medusa while in Rome or following time spent there, Harriet Hosmer and Marcello, born Adele d'Affray, the Duchess of Castiglione Colonna, whose busts are seen here. There was also Princess Louise, the Duchess of Argyll, who had trained under Mary Thornycroft in sculpture and who produced portraits of her royal family members, and whose practice may have offered a validation or example for the young De Morgan in making her case for a career in fine art. In Rome, De Morgan may have visited Hosmer's studio, a hotspot on Anglo-American tourist routes. Marcello's La Gorgone had been exhibited in London at the Royal Academy and purchased by South Kensington in 1866. Hosmer's Medusa had been produced in 1853-54, and at least one copy, probably two, remained in the UK in private hands. Both Hosmer and Marcello were working in a competitive mode, setting themselves against historic artists like Bernini and Cellini and Canova, using Medusa as an emblem of their professional status as women sculptors capable of standing alongside the greats. Furthermore, again, De Morgan had arrived in Rome having had serious artistic training for years, with exceptional access to artists working across media like Watts at a young age, personal relationships with Stanhope Spencer, and established knowledge of classical mythology. Her ability to synthesize historic art, recent and ancient, and to compellingly model an evocative figure, even at a young age, should not be that surprising. G.F. Watts, for example, had on his own first trip to Italy at a young age, not much older than De Morgan, modeled a Medusa with strong similarities to the one that De Morgan produced, although Watts was a high relief that lies flat on the surface, as you can see, more of a baleful head or architectural element than De Morgan's more Bernini-esque bust. Both Watts' alabaster head and what can be seen in the photograph of De Morgan's bust show an attention to the emotive quality of the snakes, thick, coarse locks of human hair, and strong, dramatic, rather than classical or neoclassically pretty features. These derive more substantially from models like Benvenuto Cellini's dribbling decapitated head or Bernini's Baroque beauty than the more monstrous Caravaggio or what was once believed to be Leonardo's Medusa both in the Uffizi. It's also worth noting that Walter Pater's essay on Leonardo, published in the Fortnightly Review in 1869, and again in the Studies of the History of the Renaissance, includes an extended discussion of what was believed to be Leonardo's Medusa, painted as a child. It's now attributed to an unknown Flemish painter of circa 1600, and its horrors, and it goes, quote, "What may be called the fascination of corruption penetrates in every touch its exquisitely finished beauty. About the dainty lines of the cheek, the back flits unheeded. The delicate snakes seem literally strangling each other in terrified struggle to escape from the Medusa brain. The hue which violent death always brings with it is in its features. features singularly massive and grand, as we catch them inverted in a dexterous foreshortening, sloping upwards, almost sliding down upon us, crown foremost, like a great calm stone against which the wave of the serpents breaks. While De Morgan's bust certainly lacks, probably purposefully, the macabre horror of the corpse and the insect, it doesn't shy away from the reptilian or the potency of the face. Sterling, too, writing many years later, may well have known this text, with the echoes of, quote, features massive and grand in her massive head majestic in its pose, while Pater's fascination of corruption might be read into Sterling's, quote, sense of evil, of strength, of relentless force, yet mingled with a tragedy so profound that it provokes a horror which is akin to pity. So both De Morgan and Sterling, as her chronicler, are connecting her work to the visual and textual examples of Medusa in Italian art history, reinforcing her skill by comparing her work to the old masters and validating what was still a relatively uncommon subject for sculptures in the 19th century. Now, it's useful going forward to think about what De Morgan was actually illustrating in her bust. Medusa has two sort of main origin stories, both of which the classically educated Evelyn would have known. The first is that Medusa and her two sisters were born snaky-haired monsters who lived in the desert away from mankind. Of these three, only Medusa was mortal, and they looked something like this. The second, and that primarily comes from Hesiod, the second, significantly later and now more famous version, is that Medusa was a human priestess of Athena with great hair, who unfortunately came to the attention of Poseidon. The usual god-on-human violence occurred. Athena was enraged at the violation of her temple. Athena, of course, known for her proportional and fairly distributed acts of vengeance, and punished Medusa by transforming her into the snake-haired monster. In both versions and in most modern popular culture, Medusa has the power to turn living things to stone, either by looking at them or by being looked at, and both involve Perseus charged and armed by Athena to kill Medusa by cutting off her head. From her neck, two children, the winged horse Pegasus and the human-formed Chrysaor, popped. The decapitated head was then chucked onto Athena's aegis or breastplate, wrong slide there, and became part of her attributes. In Ovid, the later version, Medusa's blood also spilled across the desert sands as Perseus flew back to Greece, which formed venomous snakes, and when some nymphs wrap up the head in seaweed to keep it fresh, the head of Medusa, or the blood, transforms the seaweed into coral. The Gorgonian, or the head of Medusa separate from her body, appears not only on Athena's armor, but on architectural elements, the armor of busts of Roman generals and emperors, sarcophagi, mosaics, and coins. You can find them literally everywhere in the fabric of Rome. So what are the two things we sort of normally think of when we think about Medusa? It's the snakes and turning people, usually men, into stone with her monsteriness, illustrated here by Uma Thurman as Medusa in Percy Jackson's Lightning Thief. The snakes are the oldest parts of the images of the Gorgon, and the most consistent symbol throughout, and we'll come back to these. First, thinking about the association with stone, Medusa turned living, animate creatures into statues, either by looking at them herself or by being looked at. A woman artist turning men, mostly, into sculptures through the power of her gaze is a potent analogy for women artists, particularly sculptures. By making images of other people in durable materials, these artists laid claim to the transformative, petrifying power of Medusa in a creative way. Now, this is not to argue that these artists, especially De Morgan, saw themselves as new Medusas. Certainly, it has been suggested by other scholars that Hosmer, at least, or in particular, may have been identifying with Medusa as a type of quote-unquote mannish woman, a figure for butch lesbians living in non-heteronormative communities. But a straightforward parallel between Hosmer, Marcello, De Morgan, Princess Louise, or any of the other women sculptors or artists active in Britain and Rome in the 19th century, and Medusa is not a comfortable or fair one to draw, especially given the contemporary obsession with Medusa as a violated woman. Rather, it is the claim to a powerful authoritative gaze and artistic control over the subject's appearance, stylistic choices, and development of a network of formal references through which a finished image relates to both the ante and preceding works of art. This means that they have the same authority over their work as their peers, their followers, and the early artists from whom they absorbed key visual lessons. The urge to frame women artists as less authoritative with less agency over their forms and ideas, overlooked and denigrated or stolen from by their male counterparts, or to read their artworks through narratives of victimization or biographical shoehorning, reduces our ability to take the study of their art beyond the basics, beyond biography, and into a critical, creative, reflective, and expansive mode of art historical study. This moves us on to snakes, and we're about 2 slides away from the snake shedding, so fair warning. De Morgan's bust includes an evocative detail that does not appear on the earlier related busts and heads, a snake crawling across the breast. Unlike Hosmer's, Bernini's, and Cellini's heads, where the snakes are more clearly growing from the scalp like hair, while also being mixed in with the mammalian hair, the De Morgan and Marcello busts show the snakes more like headdresses or reptilian hairnets. It is important to note that the snake on the De Morgan's Medusa crawls across her chest, which draws attention to where we are in the myth, after her transformation at the hands of the angry Athena, but before Perseus executes and weaponizes her. Nor is this the only appearance of a snake in De Morgan's work. The poster image for this talk was her Cadmus and Harmonia, painted in 1877, just after her return from Italy. The subject, also taken from Ovid's Metamorphoses, offered De Morgan the opportunity to demonstrate her skill in the classical female nude. Here, the nude Harmonia, with her besnaked husband Cadmus twined around her Botticelli-esque body, prays to the gods to also be turned into a snake so she can be with her husband. The contrast between Harmonia's pale, warm-toned flesh and the dark, coolly shimmering green-toned scales of the snake show off De Morgan's colorist skills and refined brush, but also suggest the frailty of human flesh and the potential of youthful feminine beauty to wither and decay against the hard, glittering gem-like surface of the snake, which may shed its skin only to re-emerge renewed. This, like Medusa, may have had touchstones in ancient sculptures seen in Italy, something like Aeon, the lion-headed god wrapped in a snake displayed at the Vatican, for example, offers an art historical prototype to be refined via De Morgan's interest in Botticelli and the female nude. Nor was this De Morgan's only Medusa. The De Morgan collection also holds a low-relief painted gesso panel showing the more familiar symbolic head as a decorative or protective device, like Caravaggio or the Gorgonian on Athena's armor. The gilt background is incised with a tangle of snakes, which both add texture to the otherwise flat panel and increase its decorative qualities, but also reinforce the snake as the key iconographic detail. Otherwise, a face on a plate could be anyone or anything. While this work lacks the emotive power of the bust, the face is a bit bland, sorry Sarah, it suggests that De Morgan found the Gorgon a compelling subject even after she returned from Italy, although as far as I'm aware, she never painted Medusa or related subjects like Andromeda or Perseus as finished oil paintings. Now it's time for the snakes. Now, snakes are complicated, symbolically. Cobras appear as part of the pharaonic regalia in dynastic Egypt. The Babylonian goddess Tiamat is sometimes shown or read as a sea serpent. The god Apollo defeated the monstrous snake Python and delivered the gift of prophecy to Cassandra through temple snakes licking her ears at night. The caduceus of Hermes with 2 snakes and the rod of Asclepius the healer with 1, in whose temple non-venomous snakes slithered freely as part of the rituals of healing. In Christianity, of course, the serpent in the garden and under Christ or Mary's heel as a symbol of the triumph over Satan, and the Ouroboros, the serpent swallowing its own tail, as sort of a global symbol of cyclicality, eternity, and rebirth. Even just the biological processes of the snake shedding its own skin or generate symbolic readings. Ecdysis, this shedding, can symbolize the shedding of old life, growth, physical and spiritual, and regeneration. The shed skin, particularly when shed nearly whole, is a ghostly reminder of the absent body. For images of Medusa, produced in Rome, like De Morgan's, the Ouroboros and shed skin evoke the cyclical growth, change, shedding, and redevelopment of the city itself. The area of Rome has had a human presence for at least 10,000 years. The founding of what we now think of as Rome was founded, according to popular legend, on April 21st, 753 BCE. The city shrank and grew, rose and fell in population, wealth, and sophistication, flowerings and witherings of artistic and cultural innovation and production, burying and re-emerging of ruins, artworks, and bones, the fragmentary, ghostly, and absent figures of ancient homes and palaces and artists, incorporated and reincorporated into the living city. Rome's appeal as La Città Eterna, the eternal city, is not one of stasis or permanence, but of overlapping palimpsestic temporalities, rebirths, and renewals. These artistic rebirths, most famously the Renaissance, a term which entered Anglophone awareness in relation to the 14th century revival of classical principles in Italian art in 1873, in Walter Pater's studies in the history of the Renaissance, 2 years before De Morgan popped across to Italy, left visible marks on the fabric of Rome. Rome shed its skin each generation or movement or regime change and reemerges, leaving the detritus and evidence of this shedding behind in the form of buildings, ruins, streets, artworks, and cultural memory, building up on top of one another and peeking through the newest generation. Even the museums through which De Morgan could have moved, like the Capitoline, reinforced the connection between their modern displays, the formation of their collections in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, the Renaissance roots, and the antiquity of their actual stuff and identity as Romans. Something like Bernini's Medusa, for example, was and is displayed in a room named for the ancient bronze geese displayed there also, against a backdrop that says SPQR about 5 times, with busts of important cardinal, or currently they're ancient busts, but they're cardinals there now, to really reinforce this connection not only with the museum itself and Rome, but also the works of art and the Gorgon. De Morgan's Medusa, produced at a time of real artistic and personal freedom, taps into this layered cyclical time space. It draws not on a single easily identified prototype image, but reflects back on multiple stages of art history through an aggregational accretive gaze. It's worth recalling that although the bust was made and cast in bronze in 1875, it wasn't exhibited until 1882. It stayed, therefore, in something like hibernation from the broader gallery-going public. Rather than a grand public statement about her status as a professional, it may be more productive to think about this as an experiment by the artist to develop her grasp of historic forms in 3 dimensions, or as an expansion of her skill set from producing convincing fictive modeling on flat surfaces into plastic modeling in the round. Now in private hands and not visible to the public, except for this photograph and a plaster version at the National Trust Lanhydrock House in Cornwall, the bust is like the absent body of the snake after shedding its skin. We know the corporeal form is somewhere, but what we are presented with is this papery, fragile echo. In its absence, we have the opportunity to project into the hollow or onto the flat surface of the photo, using what we know about De Morgan, Medusa, art history, and our own responses to works of art. What do we do with absent works of art? What would we do if we had this bust, but not the artist's name, as we do with many antiquities and early modern objects? What if we didn't know as much about De Morgan as we do? Any of these informational lacunae or shifts could, maybe should, maybe would, alter the kind of arguments that could be made about the work of art itself. Or would or should they? The bust is datable to the 1870s or 1880s based on style. We know the material, and the piece itself might have a foundry mark, allowing us to trace it to Rome or at least Italy. We know the subject and the art historical legacies thereof. Do we need De Morgan's name and biography to understand these issues? How much do De Morgan's gender, age, and social class radically or subtly shape our response to this sculpture? As much as, less than, or more than the physical appearance as we can see it? What if it was by Watts or Alfred Stevens, or a Frenchwoman like Marcello, who was even more privileged than De Morgan? She was a duchess, after all. These questions are not easily answered. I would suggest that in the work itself, what is far more important than her gender or social class is the attempt by a young artist to experiment with form and medium in response to their surroundings. It is not, based on the plaster, entirely successful, not the work of a mature sculptor, but it is compelling, with a clear indication of De Morgan's developing style. A highly stylized but convincing depiction of bodies marrying the elegance of Botticelli with the robustness of late Raphael or early Michelangelo, strongly drawn, idealized but not insipid figures reminiscent of a wounded Amazon or a Juno, questions of transformation, bodily or spiritual, like Medusa's from woman to monster to symbol, appear throughout De Morgan's career. The first painting she exhibited at the Grosvenor Gallery following her from Rome was Cadmus and Harmonia, another Ovidian myth with snakes and metamorphoses, and her interest in drawing across her career from Botticelli, from art history, the Botticelli, the Laocoon, the Mithraic figures, and you can sort of see an array here. So to draw to something resembling a conclusion, De Morgan's Medusa is a work made more complicated by its absence than its presence. Because it is functionally ephemeral, a fragile plaster, a single photograph from one book and one newspaper article, some unillustrated catalog entries from an auction and an exhibition, and produced at a liminal moment in her career, the work is difficult to tie into a singular artistic moment, project, or attitude. Think of the bust in relation to the works of art in Italy to which De Morgan had access in the early days of her career. Cellini's Perseus and the Loggia dei Lanzi on the Piazza della Signoria, Caravaggio's, and then the then attributed Leonardo's Medusas around the corner in the Uffizi Gallery, Bernini and Canova's various Medusas in Rome, Gorgons on vases and breastplates, sarcophagi and walls, and the visual fabric of Rome itself. Even the Campagna around Rome and the semi-pastoral spaces of the forums and sites within the city offer inspiration. These sites are filled with lizards and snakes. Without wanting to sound too much like an annoying young adult novel where the protagonist isn't like other girls, or to see Live, Laugh, Love Italy, where Evelyn went to sort of shed her family's expectation, we can see Italy as a place where Evelyn went to shed her family's expectation for a genteel young lady, and instead become a professional artist, leaving those expectations behind like a snake's skin, but with her character and background still housed within her metaphorically renewed intentions. De Morgan's snake women are not works which offer a single allegorical or interpretive message. I mean, really, none of De Morgan's works are that straightforward. I think the absence, however, of this bronze bust from public view and its unique position within De Morgan's career make it particularly interesting to think about in ways that, despite the long biographical preface of this paper, are not strictly biographical. Rather, in developing this material into something more formal and critical, I would be particularly interested in working through slippery, sinuous, nauseating, wriggling, shedding, sliding, cold-blooded, sun-warmed, venomous, harmless, ancient, modern possibilities offered by the figure of the snake in ancient 19th century and modern art, especially art by an artist like De Morgan, who was so educated and widely informed. The papery photograph on which the image of De Morgan's Medusa sits is a tantalizing ghostly reminder, like a snake's skin, of such a solid object. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. I always like it when people apologise to me personally when they're criticising De Morgan artworks. That's fine. I didn't make it. Honestly, just such an interesting way to look at this artist, and it's something I've been thinking about in some of my critical work recently, is to think outside of the paintings, and that's been really helpful for me and the paper I'm working on De Morgan as a craftivist or a craftwoman and a maker more so than a painter, and there's really not a lot to go on, so that's been incredibly helpful. Thank you. I'm hoping we might have some questions for Melissa. This is an opportunity for her to develop and redevelop that paper, and so I'm sure they'd be greatly appreciated. If not, then I had a really sort of basic one, because you've been to Lanhydrock and seen the plaster cast, and I've never made it down there.
I haven't. They said I had no, because it was like 14 hours on the train from where I was living when I started this. So I just emailed them and asked them, and they sent me some pictures. So one of the things I did have to drop is this. So the plaster is actually 10 centimeters smaller, according to the National Trust, than the bronze. So yeah. I don't know what that relationship is between the bust, the bronze, and I think we've talked about the fact that when I emailed them originally 7 years ago now, it was still cataloged as an unknown. It wasn't listed as being by De Morgan at all. So there's, I think, a lot to be pulled out between those two.
So I was going to comment on the snake as well. It appears that the snake from the chest is missing on the plaster cast. So I wondered if you had any sort of thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that was one of the things that's kind of confusing about this. So the socle is different, so the bust is cut differently. It's on the plaster, it's a round bust rather than the square cut on the bronze. It doesn't have the snake. So I don't know if this was an original first attempt, if it was somebody else down the line doing a copy after it later. It's definitely not a pointing model. It doesn't have points for reproduction. So it's really difficult to see without having a paper trail of where this comes from. There's no signature on it as far as the photographs I've been sent on the plaster. It is really unclear what that relationship is. It's sort of only it's identifiable as the same concept, the same design, but it's definitely not a one-to-one copy or reproduction.
So interesting. So much there, more to be learnt there. Thank you. So a couple of questions coming through. Emma, that's fine. If you want to type your question out, then I can read that to Melissa. But in the meantime, a question from Valerie. Did she do any other work at this period, or was this specific to her feelings of self at the time?
So this is produced while she's in Rome. There is she didn't do any other real sculptures at this time. There's a later Mater Dolorosa in the same studio article, but I'm not sure what the date on that is. She definitely didn't do any finished work that I've seen during the time in Rome. Cadmus and Harmonia may have begun while she was in Rome. I'm not entirely sure on that timeline. I'm really wary in particular. I've worked a lot on Harriet Hosmer's Medusa and Marcello's Medusa, which Hosmer's Medusa was produced in her second year in Rome. She was 23, 24 when she did it. It was a really similar situation. I'm really wary about connecting psychological or personal feelings to Medusa in particular, because the story in Ovid is essentially Medusa is raped by Poseidon, and she is punished for being the one who is violated for violating the temple. And that's pretty much it. That's the reading that's the story. And then she gets sent out into the wilderness and her head gets cut off by Perseus, and she becomes the Gorgonian, which is this attribution. Later in the 20th century is when we start to get this identification of women with Medusa. The mannish woman identification is definitely later. There's not much that I've been able to find in any of my work that connects, that a woman artist in particular is connecting herself to the figure of Medusa. And I've written quite a bit about this, about the danger of making that connection, other than the idea of the cementing gaze. But there's not anything I found anywhere where a woman has said, I personally connect with the idea of Medusa.
It would have to be a pretty horrific story.
It would have to be a really horrific story. And there's just not that kind of, my big theory is that Medusa as an image is really, really strongly connected to Gian Lorenzo Bernini, Antonio Canova, and Leonardo and Cellini. So they're these big names, readily accessible examples in public collections in Italy. They're in all of the guidebooks. That it's there as essentially, Annie, get your gun. Anything you can do, I can do better. That it is very much connected to artistic competition. And then once Hosmer does it, Hosmer Studio was a tourist destination for 30 years. She's on, at the time she was living just off the Spanish Steps. Her studio was in Via del Corso. So she's very connected to the aristocracy. She's friends with loads of dukes and duchesses. The Prince of Wales buys from her studio. So there is this legacy of young women going, and I think Hosmer just sets this up as this is what you do as a young woman, is you make this subject. But I'm very, very wary of, without any documented evidence, trying to read a psychological or personal identification into any of these subjects, because we just wouldn't do it with a man. It's not something, nobody's reading into Watts that he personally identifies with the head of Medusa. And Watts had a lot of feelings, and wrote a lot of them down, so we would have heard that. I hope that answers your question. Sorry,
I think I think you've demonstrated there the reasoning behind the subject choice and the fact that you know, that doesn't necessarily have to align with the artist's own projection of their
and it's hard to express how present Medusa is in Rome until you start looking for it. But once you go, I mean, literally just stuck into the side of walls as you walk down the street. There are coffins with Gorgon heads as public fountains. I think there's one in the Forum that's tipped over and used as a bench. They're literally everywhere. They're in floors. They're just, you cannot escape them. So it's this really omnipresent symbol of the city itself.
Yeah. Great, thank you. That was my post arriving. So another question from Lauren, thank you. Might there be a connection of the snake on the breast with the Cleopatra story?
That's an interesting connection. I hadn't thought of that. It might well be. I don't know. It's not in the Medusa story, so it would be sort of one of these iconographic or formal connections that's brought in from outside the traditional depiction. It would definitely, I'll have to keep that in mind. I don't have a yes or no answer for that, but it wouldn't have been a direct, typical sort of connection, but it definitely is not out of the realm of possibility.
Great, thank you. And then a question about the studio article, which I think is from about 1900.
1900, yeah.
Yeah. Is there much information with the picture in that article?
No. It basically just says, Medusa by De Morgan, bronze. And then there's like 3 lines of very florid description. It is available. I can send the link to Sarah. It's available online. It's been digitized.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone would appreciate that.
Yep.
And then a question from Emma, who's going to ask about the missing snake. Oh, sorry, Emma. But instead is going to ask about her sculptural training. Was it part of the Slade program, or is it possible she was learning that from the group of women artists when she was in Rome?
So I don't know. I've not found any explicit evidence that she spent much time with Hosmer or Marcello. My hypothesis is everybody went. If you, in Rome, you went to these studios, it was just in the guidebooks with all of their addresses and sort of, these are the studios you have to go see. It's basically like Rick Steves, where he goes, you have 3 days in Rome, go see X, Y, and Z. And sort of like Baedeker's and all of these guidebooks would say, if you have this much time, these are the studios you have to see, but here's a list of everybody. Hosmer was in Rome, Marcello was in Rome, the studios were open. I have checked that, but there's not sort of a record. She definitely didn't spend any time as a student there. Whether or not she took sculpture at the Slade School, I'm not sure. All of the references are primarily about her skill in drawing. So she got prizes for the drawing in life and drawing from the antique, not so much about painting and sculpture. The fact that we don't have anything from that period, Sterling doesn't talk about it at all. There aren't any sort of references to it that I've seen. I don't think she was doing sculpture at Slade. I think this was something like Watts, where she went, she had the opportunity to give it a go, didn't maybe necessarily find it as fulfilling, not really sure what the story is there. But it would be, I think, fairly easy to find out if she had access to sculpture studies at Slade, which is a very sibilant sentence.
But again, that's something that's available online through the University of College London online archives, is that all the prospectuses, calendars and itineraries that the students followed at the Slade are available there for that period, so we can tell what she studied. I just can't remember off the top of my head. And then sort of an interesting point to speak to that, if I may, is when she did go on this trip to Italy, she was accompanied by one of her cousins, one of the Spencer Stanhope girls, so another one of John Rodham Spencer Stanhope's nieces, but Evelyn's first cousin, called Gertrude Spencer Stanhope, who went on to be an accomplished artist in bronze and made a number of bronze figures, very different from the Medusa. So it's possible that the two of them kind of learnt their skills together, sort of learnt on the job, practicing artists, and have that kind of cross-referencing of skill coming from there. It's certainly something I've thought about before, just sort of why then, why only one? why did she not make anything else until much later? I think the Mater Dolorosa was about 1900, but that was terracotta rather than bronze. So it's interesting.
Well, and that jives with a lot of what I've worked on with my Americans, which is unfortunately, and I've spent quite a bit of time in artist studios as a student myself. I'm not any good, but I've done it. That when you're in these studios, when you're sharing studio space, you're having the conversations out loud and not necessarily leaving a written record of why you've decided to try something the way you've done it, what the advice that you're giving back and forth is. So if she had access to that material, and it's not a huge amount of material, it would have been a little essentially iron frame that looked like a bit of a balloon onto which the clay could be built, and clay and some modeling tools. It's not high tech equipment. And then once it was dried, it could easily have just been shipped to taken to one of the many artistic foundries in Rome to be cast in bronze. So it wouldn't, if she was living with or had access to her cousin's studio, that's not really a high barrier to give it a go. So that's,
as we know, for an artist of means, it's something very done.
Yeah. And I'm sort of questionable on, there's the line about the dress budget kept purposefully scanty, about how much they actually cut her off. I think
very much she was off from things like other diaries that belong to different members of the family and from census records. We know that she was very well supported, particularly by her father, who mentions at least 3 drawing tutors that he employs for her. The fact that she was allowed to go to the Slade, like she just wouldn't have been allowed to if her parents had decided it wasn't happening. She had the run of the house to herself, basically, as her own studio while she was in London. She bought her studio and then she started selling paintings.
Yeah.
She had her own money. Different legislation that meant she could keep that by the early 1880s. So she had money.
Well, and sterling is very much, that's why I try to always, whenever I have to sort of talk about sterling, because unfortunately it's basically the only source for the Medusa, is that she's very much playing into a series of tropes about artistic biography and women's biography from this time. So everything she says needs to be taken with a grain of salt. And it becomes really clear when she's recounting these conversations that happened like when she was 2, and how like every single relative that they have is described as just incredibly good looking.
But why not?
But why not? If you have, who's going to contradict you? But it very much is this, like, this is not an unbiased source talking about her sister's life. And if you're trying to, because a lot of the stuff that comes out about the American women in sort of the early 20th century is that it was this triumph over the situation. It gets dragged into the sort of this girl can, rarely behaved women, well-behaved women rarely make history tropes that were established as early as the mid-19th century about special women who like defied their circumstances to become successes. And you still see it and you're sort of going, they were upper middle class. Their dads cut them checks every month. It's not what you think it is. So, and then a question from about what is
go ahead if you
so there's the question from Emily about the Morris. What's the date on the Morris poem again? I can't remember off the top of my head. Do you have that?
From the Earthly Paradise.
Yeah, 1860s. So yeah, that would definitely be, I would buy that as a source. I'm very skeptical, unless an artist explicitly says this is the source that I'm using, that there's one literal source, especially for an artist like De Morgan, who had access to sort of all of this material very early on, that I would absolutely think that this is, a really good source for that. I think you're right, and I'm definitely going to be writing that down after. Thank you.
Yeah, and to that, yes, she did read Morris. I don't know if she directly read The Earthly Paradise, but we know that she read Morris, and his the life and death of Jason, whichever it is. An excerpt of that was displayed next to her painting of Medea when that was first displayed. So
yeah,
it's definitely a possibility. It's a really good point, Emily. Thank you.
Yeah, and so it may be one of these ones that's a detail that was in her head and incorporated it without necessarily illustrating that specific text, because she also would have read Shelley on the Medusa of Leonardo and the Uffizi. I can't imagine she didn't read Pater either in the periodical or once it was published. So I think there's a lot of material around to which she had recourse to create sort of her own image, and that she would have been, like they all were, pulling little bits to pull together her own image. But I think if there is that explicit text, that's where I would think that would be bang on from that.
It's the perfect description, isn't it? Any more questions or comments or points to make on this wonderful topic? Something that, as far as I'm aware, Melissa, just hasn't been investigated before, but actually interrogating that use of the snake. Why was it a symbol? What was she doing with it? Has made for some really fascinating insights. So thank you so much.
I am hoping this is sort of the kick that I needed to get it. I've been thinking, as you know, I've been thinking about this for like 6 or 7 years now. And so I've just needed sort of the kick to sit down and write it all down, and sort of develop it. So hopefully, these are really useful questions for me, sort of as I try to polish it into something a bit more formal and footnoted and thought through, and not just sort of snakes.
Great. Well, I think that's everybody, and we're just within the hour, so I'll let you all go and get your lunch. Thanks again so much, Melissa. Great to have you, and to come up with these sort of really insightful ways of looking at the artworks. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you. Good afternoon. Bye.